Well, I am curious for John Lithgow, what were your first impressions reading that screenplay, and what was it that drew you into playing this part?
The screenplay came fervently recommended to me by my agent, Brian Swardstrom, who is the one, I believe, who got you interested in me playing the part.
Yeah.
So I give him great credit for engineering this. Agents are not always the reason things happen, but in this case it was.
Well, I am one lucky moderator with John Lithgow in the middle and Ira Sachs on my far right. And I'm going to start with a question for the writer-director. I mean, you co-wrote the screenplay with Mauricio Zacharias, and I wanted to know how this project developed, and also at what point in the writing of the screenplay did you think of John Lithgow and Alfred Molina for the parts?
Well, this film, like all my films, is very personal. I would say it is not autobiographical, but as a writer-director, I'm always arriving at ideas that somehow resonate to me and that I think I can live with for 3 or 4 years. And in my early 40s, I started a relationship with a man, Boris Torres, who is now my husband, who's here somewhere in the back. And that relationship, but also kind of where I was in my own life, it was actually for the first time I felt that there was a potential for love to grow and blossom in the future with the two of us. And that still feels possible. And that was something very new for me. All my previous films had been about the possibility of love to destroy everyone involved. And I was happy to say at that point in my life, I liked myself, and I was in a situation personally where it seemed like I could be in a relationship that could grow. And so I wanted to make a love story. My co-writer Mauricio and I heard about a case in the Midwest, and I actually only read the article once, but it was about a couple who got married. One of them had been a choir director for a Catholic high school, lost his job, and we thought that that was a good beginning. It set the gun off for our story. And so we wrote from there and came up with this idea of them losing their apartment and having this separation. And then the film came for us. It was always driven by this central relationship, but it was really a film about the seasons of life and these 3 generations that come into contact through the story. The very first person I cast was Alfred Molina, who was recommended to me, and I knew his work from many years, but specifically Prick Up Your Ears and Boogie Nights were 2 performances that I really responded to. And Alfred got involved, and then it was about a year between that point and when the money came together and the film came together. And there's always a series of castings that happen, and then if you're a good director, you keep it always getting better. And right towards the end, John's name came up, and I grabbed it very quickly, and we were ready to go, and he and I met probably 2 weeks later, and a month after that, we were shooting the film. So it was very quick. And I knew that they knew each other, but I didn't actually know what would develop between them during the shooting, and that is something that John can talk about also.
Yeah. Well, I am curious for John Lithgow, what were your first impressions reading that screenplay, and what was it that drew you into playing this part?
The screenplay came fervently recommended to me by my agent, Brian Swardstrom, who is the one, I believe, who got you interested in me playing the part.
Yeah.
So I give him great credit for engineering this. Agents are not always the reason things happen, but in this case it was. And he said, this is something really good, pay attention to this. So I got quite excited before even opening the script. I loved the script. It is so rare where you just unqualifiedly love a piece of movie writing, because it's not easy to read a screenplay anyway. This and Terms of Endearment, I say, are the 2 scripts that I just oh my God, I've got to do this. And in this case, it was the main part. I mean, it was one of the two main parts. And Fred Molina was attached. And I immediately saw it. When something is good, you see yourself in it immediately. And you know, I can do this. I can probably do this better than anybody else I can think of. And I knew that Fred and I would be a fantastic pairing. He and I had about a 12-year-long friendship. We weren't close friends by any means, but we'd met socially many times. I'd seen him in many things and visited him backstage. We actually had a very sad thing in common. A very dear friend of both of ours, the actress Eileen Getz, a young actress, died. And we sat in her hospital ward for an entire afternoon and just talked. And that was the beginning of at least the deeper layers of our friendship. So it was a gift. Then I read the script, absolutely loved it, called Brian, said, yes, of course we do this, and went off to meet Ira, and Ira was just as good as the script. I just loved the guy. We were right on the same page in terms of how to approach this. It's a very unusual role for me, really. I mean, both Alfred and I are extravagant character actors. That's sort of what we're known for, bravura. We're theater actors who bring a lot of theater to the movies. And Ira was after something very different, and I think both Alfred and I were hungry for it. I remember in our conversation, I said to you, it would be, if I do this, I mean, I want to do this so badly, it will be such a relief not to have to do any acting. Do you remember me saying that? And you said to me, what exactly do you mean? But in fact, he said no acting about 100 times in the course of...
Well, it's interesting because the term,
I mean this in a good way.
Part of it, and I think you'll see this tonight, just spending a little time with John, is that there was a man here that I was very interested in across the table that I was speaking to who I hadn't seen on film, who was very, there was a level of sophistication and nuance and humility and passion that I was like, the guy's in there. That said, it's all acting. You know, it's not like you played yourself.
It's not all acting. It's half acting and half writing.
Oh, that's true. I'm just saying that there is a being that you know, to me, acting is all about listening and responding, and that's what all good acting is about. And I think you were very much in a place where that was happening on set in a very complex way in the portrait. So,
whether during rehearsal or during shooting, was it that sometimes you would do something that was a little more actorly, and that you would take it down a notch, or was it always the half acting?
Well, it was the former. He frequently told me to moderate it, but I would say we sort of hit the right pitch early on. Yeah. I have to tell you about rehearsal with Ira, though. It's non-existent. He does not want us to rehearse. I was working on a film in Calgary, Alberta, and Ira traveled there for 2 days, spent 2 days with me over a weekend. And we went through every line of the script. We talked in depth about me and my past life, about Ben's past life. He altered Ben's past life to sort of fit with my past life. He developed a timeline when Ben and George would have met, what their early years would have been like, all of this. Then he went to LA, spent another 2 days with Fred, going through the whole thing. We didn't sit together. We did have supper together, but that was strictly to get to know each other, really. He wanted it all to happen when we were on the set doing the camera blocking. Yeah. And even the camera blocking barely existed. Ira wanted it to happen when the cameras came on. And that's what you see in the film.
Yeah, well, it was something, I was a theater director before I was a film director, and I think one of the biggest things I've learned as a film director is to stop talking and to not make, a lot of theater direction is about trying to get something to the point in which it can be repeated, and film direction is the opposite. I made a film called 40 Shades of Blue, and Sidney Pollack was the executive producer on that film, and he was actually the man who kind of gave me permission not to rehearse, because that was his way of doing it also. And it suddenly was like a light bulb that in actuality a shooting set is about you shoot every scene for about 8 hours. There's a lot of rehearsal that takes place in the process of shooting something. It just doesn't have to be attached to in a way that can be repeated the next day. It has to be discovered in the process.
In fact, it should be discarded the next day, as long as it's on film.
Yeah.
And I think that part of the coherent tone of this film, it's not just the beautifully understated performances. I also realized the second time watching it tonight how much of the story is not actually presented. You have these ellipses, like all of a sudden Ben is living at his nephew's and Marissa Tomei, who's so wonderful. I will ask you though about something that's kind of, I found the ending a bit truncated because yes, I did feel a bit of foreboding or closure when Ben goes down that West 4th Street subway. But then when the son brings the painting to George and we learn that Ben has died and that the service is past, I went, when did that happen? I didn't get to see it.
Right.
So I'm curious about that decision, and did you actually shoot something like the death of Ben or the service and then decide not to use it? No, of course not. Go right ahead.
To me, this is a film that's always about life. It really was not a film about death. It was about passing and seasons and generations and many themes that were important to me, but the act of death was not one of them. And I've always been interested in stories, novels, and films that propel the audience forward and sometimes through the gaps. The gaps are in a way, what is that? It's a human gap. It's what happens. It's this feeling that suddenly things have shifted, and part of the audience's connection to the film is that intimate relationship to piecing it all together and feeling that life is actually what's propelling the film forward, not the story, not the characters, not the script. And so I try to replicate that through ellipses, which, Henry James has one in Washington Square, which is my favorite ellipse, in which the whole film takes place the whole story takes place with this woman who's very much in love with this man, and she wants and she wants and she wants, and then there is a moment when she doesn't get, and then the next chapter you learn that was the last time that ever happened, and we are now propelled forward. And to me, it's breathtaking. And I think I'm attracted to those moments which, if it works, you are involved, but you don't. It comes with the unexpected.
Okay.
There's another thing. When I saw the film in December, the completed cut, and I immediately called Ira, and I told him one of my strongest reactions was that his decisions what to delete from the film were brilliant, because there are many scenes that we shot and are not in the film, and this is a film that was shot in 27 shooting days. So if you lose a scene, that's quite a bold decision.
Yeah.
There was an entire storyline, really, that is now not there, and I won't tell you what it was. Don't worry, it did not involve me and Alfred.
Well, I don't mind.
No, you're fearless about this. But the thing is, Ira sees, it's very much an illustration of what he just said. He finds ways of sort of thrusting the story forward by eliminating things, rather than by overtelling, by undertelling. And there are, I had 3 or 4 scenes, which I was very pleased with. I thought I was great in them. But I was very glad they were not there, because they over-explained the story. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
I mean, on reflection?
Well, I'll tell you that there was an element between the relationship between Marissa Tomei and Darren Burroughs, which is to me the couple in the middle. It's really about this older couple who are at the autumnal phase of their life together. There's the middle couple, which is kind of the position I'm at, which is in my late 40s now, and trying to figure out what are the limitations of my life. and what are the unexpected things? And I think that's very much what Marissa is struggling with. And then there's this kid who's discovering love and family and many things for the first time. And love, I would say a familial love mostly, and then maybe with this girl. But at one point we learned more about what happened between the Marissa Tomei character and there was a separation. And at a certain point when you write a film, you direct a film, and it has a math, and the film can only hold so much. And you have to figure out, that's what editing is about, is what will it hold naturally. And so there was a process of elimination.
And I do believe that gave you the opportunity to let the film breathe.
Yeah.
You know, the beautiful, beautiful longueurs in the film, which just allow the emotions to breathe.
I mean, and I'm guessing because you were already, what you left in the film, suggesting that her husband is unfaithful. In other words, that he's having an affair, because there's just this, lack of physical bonding between them. When he comes in, he's asleep. She wants to talk, and perhaps more. So am I right in assuming that would have been developed in what was cut from the film?
There was no answers to those questions in the script either. It was definitely on the table.
There were more questions.
Which is good. I mean, in my classes at Columbia, so often I choose films that force the viewer to take a more active role in unraveling the story. I mean, to participate in the actual storytelling process, because a movie that gives us everything, the beginning, the middle, and an end, and it's so predictable. We can see it coming, and we don't have to work very hard. And I kind of like the movies that make me work a little harder to understand how we're getting from A to Z.
By the way, this is the movie that makes people work the least of all my movies. I mean, to the extent that it is actually a pretty conventional narrative story, and on a lot of levels. It is, and also I think there's just a lot of elements which make it very accessible to an audience. What I feel is that the questions that people asked in the editing process have not been the questions people ask tonight. I mean, I'll be interested, but in terms of, because I think the film, it holds together, and I think people have what they need to feel with the film.
Oh, that's absolutely true. Now, in the closing credits, you are credited as one of the painters. In other words, your art is in the film.
Right under Keith Haring. My pride and joy.
And since I mentioned to the audience that you write, poetry and children's books and painting, I mean, did you paint prior to this film? Is it just the painting that we see you do, or?
No, when I was a young man, I wanted to be a painter, and I was very serious about it until age 19, when I decided to be an actor instead. I grew up in a theater family and did not want to be an actor. I wanted to be a painter. And I've always actually wanted to play a painter in something. And can you imagine the moment reading the script when I learned, oh my God, Ben is a painter! Actually, Ira and I discussed the possibility of using my own paintings. He even came into my house and looked at a lot of paintings. I sent him some images, just taken with an iPad. But we decided, for various reasons, not to use my art. For one thing, they had to have a half-painted picture that played before I could even be there for the shooting. Ira's husband is a wonderful painter, Boris Torres, and Boris and I got together and spent an afternoon painting each other's portrait and just coming up with a sort of common style. And he half-painted a picture, and that's what I work on, I work on a painting which will end up being Boris's half-painted picture, which had already been featured in a scene that was shot before I arrived. It was very complicated. Ira thought it all through and gave it a lot of thought. So they didn't use my art, but he wanted to use one of my paintings in the set dressing. So I don't know whether you remember, but my favorite moment in the film, he follows a character through a hallway into the kitchen, but the camera stops as the character moves out, and there's my painting, a nice close-up. It was a Brazilian boy on the deck of a boat, That's my
I
painting.
do remember that. That's yours.
That's my painting.
Very fine indeed.
It helped a lot that John knew how to paint.
Yeah.
So the scenes of painting were very, we didn't have to spend training someone to be able to do the work of creating color, how to use the paintbrush and there's a real veracity to that stuff on the roof particularly, which I think is John.
And a nice choice that we made in the scene where I'm talking about how troubling it was, the things that Joey had said to me, for me to be cleaning my paintbrushes. We just did that, and it was a wonderful activity to carry you through that scene.
And part of the reason I even asked the question is that the last film I showed to the Real Pieces audience was Words and Pictures, where some of us were pleasantly shocked to learn that Juliette Binoche had actually painted the very paintings we saw in the film. And one could even extrapolate a little bit into, it would make for a good double bill in a certain sense. And it does lead me to another question, because much like that film, we have a very strong screenplay. We have wonderful performances where words are given full voice. But there's also music. Somebody brought that up with the other film as well. We've got wall-to-wall Chopin here. I mean, you use the Chopin score from the opening credits to the very end. And it does provide a tone that is beautiful and understated for me. Could you talk about, first of all, did you play Chopin on the set, even when the actors were shooting? Was it there always from beginning to end, or was it added later?
Well, we wrote, Mauricio, Zacharias, my co-writer, is much more knowledgeable about music than I am, and we had the scene, the piano teaching scene, where Alfred is playing with this little girl who was 8 and was playing what you saw on screen, and is in a, mini Juilliard school just around the corner, studying 17 hours a day to be that good, and we wrote in a Chopin etude for that piece. So, which was helpful, but it was not around during the set and during the production. I had, in my previous film, a film called Keep the Lights On, I had used all the music of a musician named Arthur Russell, and I had used it in the way, I was very inspired by The Graduate, which had used Simon and Garfunkel to create the entire score of a movie, and how that creates a kind of unity of sound that works with the film but also separate from the film, and I like that. So I had already done that trick once, and I suddenly, with my editors, thought that this might work well with the film after we'd shot it. And we started listening to Chopin and created, what I discovered is that Chopin is, obviously it's beautiful, but it's also incredibly narrative and incredibly varied in terms of the emotions that you find, and the surprises that kept happening when we put the image and the music together were part of the pleasure, I think, that we discovered, and we hoped the film would have as well.
Yeah, it was a big surprise to me when I saw it.
One little thing about the Chopin is the last piece is the same as the first piece, and it's called the Berceuse. And what I didn't know about Chopin, I'm sure most of you do, is he never wrote orchestrations. He never wrote full for orchestra. It was my music editor, who is a wonderful woman named Susanna Perrick, who had also done The Pianist and done most of Polanski's work, very knowledgeable woman. She said, there was a piece in the 20th century where someone orchestrated Chopin, and perhaps we could use that. So as the credits come up, you hear this movie music come up, and that wasn't Chopin's, it is his, the melody is his, but it was an original to the 20th century, and it really helps with the film.
Wow. A question for John Lithgow, because I know that you've been married for decades to the same woman, and I was wondering, when you approached the character of George, to what extent the dynamics of your own marriage were, something that could inspire the performance of this one.
It was the prime reference for me. I mean, I've known my wife for 35 years. We've been married for 33 years, and I mean, there's something very particular about the relationship between Ben and George, just their longevity, how long they, I remember being told years ago by a friend of mine who'd been married for 35 years. I said, Renee, how did you how do you stay married that long? And he said, well, you know, if you've been married for 35 years, it really means you've had about 5 different marriages. And that's, you know, every chapter of your life is very different. And that's my reference point. I mean, the sort of, the interesting mixture of comfort and discomfort, of perfect harmony and crankiness and disharmony. You know, we all know that. Everybody who's been in a long relationship knows all about that. The fact is, you know that other person as well as you know yourself. And there is someone in your life who knows you so deeply. That's, I would say, was my touchstone. So it was essential in a way. And Fred, who, by the way, Fred is not here. It always makes me melancholy to do these things without him, because he's so part and parcel of the experience. He too has a 28, 29-year-old marriage. So we shared this together. I said, you know, this is such a marriage.
Right.
So the answer is yes.
And I particularly appreciate the very term that you used, touchstone, because one of the things that moves me in this film is the quiet moments of literally a touch, like they're in the kitchen and just, you know, a touch here.
And I have to tell you, that you should find the screenplay. That is, every gesture in that scene is in the screenplay. Me washing that tray, Fred wrapping things up and putting them in the fridge, leaning over and kissing me. It's all described in the screenplay. And it's true. And it was one of the things that sold me on those first 20 pages. Like, wow, this guy knows exactly what he's doing.
Well, it comes through. And actually, I am curious about another thing, because this is such a New York movie. I mean, to me, this is as much about the city that I have lived in for most of my life by choice as it is about the characters. And indeed, the whole question of apartments, real estate, I mean, those are very pressing, literally and figuratively, in the film. And yet it feels very different from, let's say, a Woody Allen movie, which I'm sure many people have compared this to, especially because you have this wonderful classical soundtrack and images of New York City that make you want to stay here or move here. Could you talk a little about whether there are other directors whose work has been kind of shaping for you? It doesn't have to be Woody Allen. I felt Cassavetes at one point, or Ozu at another point, but you can maybe...
Well, you hit all the nails on the head there. I mean, those are Woody Allen, particularly for this film. Mauricio and I watched Husbands and Wives and Hannah and Her Sisters. Those were 2 films that were very much, because he was able to balance a lot of different stories. We were definitely telling a different story about New York, and one that's more familiar to me in terms of its diversity, in terms of the range of characters, and everybody doesn't have money in this film, in fact. But those were, to me, very beautiful films that I remembered and hold up just as well. When Mauricio and I first started working together, which was in 2010, there was a summer festival of Ozu at the IFC Center, and I must have just been at the right age where Ozu was speaking to me, and we went every Saturday at 11 o'clock for about 10 or 12 weeks and saw a good amount of Ozu, who made 40 or 50 films that were always about domestic life, that managed to make the ordinary extraordinary, which is, to me, what I love about movies still, is this very small things that can seem very big in the right hands. So Ozu, Cassavetes was someone that I discovered in '86. I lived in Paris. I'd never heard of him. I was from Memphis, Tennessee. I didn't speak French, and I ended up going, at that point, I was there for a semester while we were both at Yale. I was an undergraduate, and you were just starting out there. And I discovered Cassavetes among 197 films I saw in the 3 months I lived in Paris. Changed my life. And I started making movies with that in my mind. At a certain point, it was, I worked for Eric Bogosian, and he had seen a couple of my films, and Eric said to me, it is very important for you to stop watching Cassavetes. and it was very good advice. So, but for me, the last name that I will mention, it was very important to the visual quality of this film, is Maurice Pialat, who is a French filmmaker, the Cassavetes of France, you might say, and is someone that I have been deeply engaged in, visually particularly, but in many ways for my whole career.
Yeah.
Was someone we studied, my cinematographer and I, for this film.
And your cinematographer, because we showed a few months ago when Julie Delpy was our guest before midnight, it's the same cinematographer, if I'm not mistaken,
Correct.
Christian Boudreau?
Christos Voudouris. Christos, yes, he's a Greek fella and has a beautiful use of light. I mean, one of the things I admired in that film and his other work was and a natural lighting that is, to me, not a traditional Hollywood setup, but extremely aesthetically strong and rigorous, and that's a style that I respond to.
Yeah, and the last part of the film, the skateboarding in the street, I mean, the light is such an important
I want to say
palpable
one thing about that scene, because you talk about New York, and I think one of the things that we tried to do is really be attentive to New York. Both, I've been here for 25 years, the New York I know, but also the New York that we discovered in shooting the film. And in that scene particularly, I had cast a girl to play the skateboarder, and I had seen a couple of videos that she sent me. She was 14 and from Long Island, and she was an extra, so I'd never met her. And we arrive on the set, and we'd actually closed down Morton Street to shoot that. It was our biggest day, because we had the police and all, not cranes, but lots of things were going on. And I watch her, and she's with her father, and she's down the street, and it's very clear that she cannot skate. And we're all there, and 100 crew members. I mean, this was a big day for us, and I'm thinking, well, we're either going to have to teach her how to skate in the next hour, I don't think so, or we're going to close down, or I don't know what we're going to do. And I'm watching her, and she starts to sweat. I mean, she's very nervous. There's a lot of pressure, and she really can't do it. And I see out of the corner of my eye a ponytail go by. And I thought, I don't know if it's a male or a female ponytail, but it seemed like it was on a skateboard and possibly female. So I turned to my producer, Jay Van Hoy, and I said, I think that was a girl on a skateboard. And he runs. And he gets about a block, and Alfred Molina's getting out of a van, and Jay gets on the van, and he follows this girl 3 blocks. Then she turns, he gets off, she goes down to the PATH train. He follows her down to the PATH train. He gets there, he taps her on the shoulder and says, "You want to be in a movie?" The girl you see is exactly as dressed, and she came and she did our movie. And that's the kind of that is what film does that's so incredible, which is you just grab what's happening in life.
Sure.
And you hope for some of that to come through.
Absolutely. That was
Ira is a much better man than I am. I advised him not to tell that story. And he said, no, that's exactly what it's about.
But we love hearing this sort of detail because you have made it very clear to us the extent to which Ira's preparatory work, mainly the screenplay and then the way he worked with actors, is so crucial to how this film works. But then to learn about a fortuitous grace note like this is fascinating because heaven knows movie making is not only about intention, it's also about the gifts that come from the universe while you're shooting and afterwards.
And that come from I don't, as John says, I'm pretty strict about the script, but I actually want them to improvise emotionally all the time. And you have to create an environment where that kind of emotional improvisation is possible. And so the control also has to be very loose. It's an interesting position.
Sure. Now, I have to shift gears a little bit before we take questions from the audience because I had the great fortune of seeing King Lear 2 nights ago in Central Park. And while I was watching your towering performance, literally and figuratively, I couldn't help but feel that the predicament of the title character and that of Ben in this film is not so different because unaccommodated man is the great line from King Lear. I mean, he, the king, and Ben have lost their place. They both have nowhere to stay. And I was just wondering, am I stretching too much? Am I pushing this point? Or do you feel the connection between these two roles?
Well, I have to say I certainly didn't feel a connection until you mentioned it to me earlier. But, you know, I think King Lear goes spreading out in all directions. Ira's going to see it later in the week. You'll have the same experience. Yeah. Every time you see the play, it's got new dimensions that you were not, depending on the production, different things come to the fore. But it is, you know, the terrible, terrible pain of an old man being sent out, having the door shut behind him, and him being defiant and saying, "Fine, I don't need a place to stay," and running off by himself. I mean, that is so harrowing, and you do connect it with a story like that. Working on King Lear, everybody in the cast connected it with his or her own life, particularly people over 60 years old who have seen their parents grow old and seeing them lose different degrees of viability. It's extremely painful. It's redemptive, but it's very painful.
I can imagine. And I'm curious because Lear has been such a defining role. I remember seeing Paul Scofield.
I saw it. Yeah.
And how did you end up playing Lear? Because we know that in this case, Ira Sachs got the script to you through your agent. How did Lear in the Park come about?
I sent an email to Dan Sullivan last October. I said, "Is this a crazy idea?" And that got the ball rolling.
So it originated with you.
Yeah.
Oh,
I had lunch with with Oscar Eustace the year after he became head of the Public Theater, just to talk about, and that also was I invited him to have lunch with me. And I talked about Lear then, and that was 10 years ago. I was too young to play it then, but I didn't stop me from asking. I mean, it's been the answer to the question all these years: what is the one role that you would eventually like to play? And at that point, Oscar said, I remember his phrasing perfectly. He said, "Well, there is a bit of a queue." At that point, he thought Morgan Freeman was next in line. In fact, 2 other actors have played it since that lunch, but they didn't play it in the Park.
Now, and talk about control. I mean, certainly when you're making a film like Love is Strange, there's a degree of control that both actor and director can exert. But I'm assuming that even in just the past week, because you've only been doing the play since the 22nd, 1 week, I think the word control sort of goes out the window because there are so many extraneous elements that enter into it, like weather.
Yes, we had a fantastic weather night Wednesday. It was everything Shakespeare would have dreamed of. But the person in control is Dan Sullivan, who is, I'd done 2 other productions with him. I love working with him, but I had no idea. He's a marvelous director of Shakespeare. Just marvelous.
By the way, it's a stupendous cast that includes a former Real Pieces guest, Annette Bening, as Goneril. And across the board, I thought the performances were just amazing.
Pretty special.
I have tons more questions, but I have a funny feeling that some of you have questions, so I'm going to stop for a second and make sure that we can get the lights just a little bit higher up, so that if someone has a question, you can raise your hand and I will repeat it. And if not, I just have quite a few more. There is one hand right over there. Yes? When you were writing this, was there any thought to having George and Ben go live together at one of the relatives or friends?
No, I mean, you know, I think that there is a, it's like Shakespeare. You got to have the thing needs its plot, and the plot was about separation, and that is kind of the thing also which reveals this couple's strength is how they overcome that separation over time. So no.
Although there is that discussion in the staircase. Initially, both of them were going to go up to Poughkeepsie.
Yeah,
They did.
But don't be silly.
That's right.
Well,
but that was a no-brainer.
I love
you
Poughkeepsie.
even
I really
have
don't believe that.
you have the additional moment when Marissa Tomei is on the phone with the cousin in Poughkeepsie.
Yeah.
And basically says to Ben, when are you going to go visit her?
Yes,
and
right.
Ben beautifully evades the entire thing. We'll talk tomorrow.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I realized that the sort of dirty word in this screenplay is Poughkeepsie, because it would have solved a lot of problems in the film, but then there isn't any dramatic tension.
Right.
You know, then it just becomes a question of transportation rather than real estate.
They would also have to live with those dogs, and
Yeah.
if you saw them, they
Okay, there was a hand right there.
Kids could be really, really bad. How come you only selected taking French books from the library as their
Since kids can be really bad, why was the greatest crime stealing French books from the library? Why choose that?
Well, we didn't want these kids to be really bad, to be honest. That wasn't these kids. And, so the more obvious plot choices could have been on a higher level of things. I actually stole the French books from my library when I was a teenager.
Ah,
So
there's your answer.
So I had a wealth of experience to draw from, including the arrogance that came with that kid thinking that somehow he would be the only person, that somehow he thought well, at least I'll just say because I don't know it's a little murkier with him. We don't hear all the stories. But I thought I would be the one who would actually end up learning French from my high school, which, by the way, I don't speak French, so it was not true. But it was just a kind of mischievous thing which connected to this period, which all of us can relate to, of trying to push against the boundaries.
Okay,
There's another question.
in the back, yes.
Thank you.
Sorry, my voice. I wanted to know if you ever contemplated having him run into that girl from St. Croix. I almost thought that after he had that moment of crying when he was going down the stairs, I almost thought that some fortuitous moment was going to come and he was going to remember his uncle and tap into that. But my question is, at the end with the light. So you talked about how your films represent life. I actually felt like the light was like heaven and his uncle was there, but was it more like love and hope and something? Like what was it like when you were reading?
Did you all hear a question about what does the light represent at the end?
Well, I realized after this film that 4 of my 5 films have ended with people on a road heading somewhere. So clearly to me there is this sense that the films that I respond to what I want in my own films is for them to be to the end of the film to open up and in a way be handed back over to the audience. That this is it's a point of reflection on some level. So the definition of what the light means or the sunset means or the end of the movie is not one that I would want to answer, because I think I'm really trying to lead you to some sort of connection with yourself as an audience member. I have my own answers.
The film, I had a John Lithgow week because I saw Shakespeare in the Park opening night and now this.
Lucky you.
We're both quite lucky, I think, in that respect. Yes, over there, and then closer to the aisle.
So I was trying to figure out, I also saw you in Shakespeare in the Park and I was curious about the timeline. Do you think that they ever lived together in that apartment, or did he die before they had a chance to ever reunite?
You want to?
That's the $64,000 question. And it's interesting because Ira and I kind of disagreed on that. I think probably I have a more conventional storytelling mindset. I thought it was very powerful and poignant to think that was the last time they ever saw each other, when Ben went down the subway stairs. As he does, Ira leaves things poetically undecided, unstated, and lets you make the decision. But in his view of the story,
there was some time, but that this wasn't the next day or the next week, but that over time, over the next few months. And yeah, I guess if, in my story, they would have probably moved in together, and because they were heading that way, and then the passage happened.
In the screenplay, there were 2 or 3 moments when there was this kind of thing. And early on, Ira said, let's not do that. He didn't want you to feel that Ben's life was fragile, that his heart was going to give out. There's one mention of it, and he leaves it at that. Just another illustration of his.
Yes. Yeah. Things were, I feel like you got it. There was something going on. He goes down the subway, People die,
We don't want these characters to die, though.
Well,
That's
I think
part
that
of
the
issue.
thing that is testament to Alfred and John's performance is the thing I think most people remember when they leave this film, among hopefully many things, including Marissa Tomei, which we haven't talked about, is this relationship. You believe that you've met this couple. You know these two men, that they're people in your own familiar realm. And I think that's really about what they've done with this material.
The other thing we haven't touched on is where this film sits in today's social and political landscape, which I find that I'm talking about constantly in most press interviews, that the film puts a very vivid face on this whole front page issue of same-sex marriage. It's something you simply have not seen. You haven't seen a quite ordinary older gay couple who've been together for 40 years, who have a completely viable life that has been deprived of the right to get married. And you love these people. You love them, and you find it a great injustice that they've had to sort of accept this these crumbs, this sort of second-class citizenship for so many years, the trade-off being that they could at least live together and be close together. But when they walk down the street, they walk down the street without touching each other, which does not happen with straight couples. What I think is revolutionary about this gentle little film is that it puts a face on that. And I think it's an act of great, it's an important act and a courageous act on Ira's part. And I'm really proud to be part of it.
Thank you.
Yes.
I just wonder with parents' resistance to their son's relationship with the other kid, how do you do with their reacting to possibly the gay relationship?
The question is about the parents' reaction to their son's relationship to Vlad, whether that is partly because of Ben and George. I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Sorry, whether it was their reaction to the relationship between Ben.
Oh.
Whether it was a reaction partly to the relationship of Ben and George.
In my mind, it was, I'm a new parent. I have my husband and I are raising two 2-year-olds at this point, twins. We live next door to their mom, so we're in a co-parenting situation where we have raised these wonderful kids. And to me, I really identify with that father who's just not sure that it's going right. Whatever it is, his teenager's life seems to be small and wrong. And I don't necessarily know if he even knows why he feels that way. It's a form of the complicated things of being, being a family man or woman, which is how much control can we exert and how much can we not, and that struggle then between these two parents. So I'm not sure you can put a label on what the problem is, but it's a problem.
But one feels that there's a tension in every generation, whatever the particular
Yes.
source is. On the aisle?
I love the film.
Thank you.
I think something that should be brought to the attention of everyone. The sad thing is, I'm afraid that the people who should see it will not see it.
the fear that the people who should see this film might not see this film.
The ones that you learned from this film or not?
Well, I don't think that's true. I think many people will see this film who really should see it. I mean, there's this growing feeling this film is going to be very successful, I think. I always knew it was going to be a wonderful film, but I never really thought it would be a crossover film in an important way. We didn't make the film for a targeted audience. We were not interested in preaching to the converted. We didn't even think in terms of preaching. But it's beginning to dawn on me that this film just might expand people's consciousness on this issue.
And I think for me as an artist, it's not a mission film. It's a story. It has issues that are certainly relevant, but that's because as a filmmaker, you're partially a historian. You're trying to get something about your time that's right and that's accurate and that's meaningful. But you know, I read this great quote, which I shared with John today, which was talking about Ozu. And it was saying about this film, and it was making some nice comparisons between this film and Ozu, and it was saying you can't really call it a queer film or a gay film because that would be like calling Ozu just a Japanese filmmaker, and that his films are just about Japanese people, which is why his films were not popular when they first came out, because people thought, well, they're about Japanese people. I'm not going to understand these. I'm not going to get anything from this because I don't relate. In truth, they were human films. And I think that as an artist, that's what you set out to do, which is to make a human story.
If you'll allow me to go from the sublime to the ridiculous, let me tell you a story about the movie Footloose. When I was working on Third Rock from the Sun, we did an episode where the 4 aliens, for some reason, ended up working in a circus. And there was a great, big, handsome guy who played the strong man in the circus. And after we'd been rehearsing for a couple of days, he took me aside and he said he'd been waiting for the right time to talk to me. He said, I come from a little town in Louisiana. And my daddy was the Baptist preacher in that town. And when Footloose came out, I went to see Footloose, and you were my daddy. My daddy wouldn't let people listen to rock and roll or dance. And I took my daddy to see that movie the next night without telling him anything about it. By this time, tears were streaming down his cheeks. And he said, I just have to tell you that because of your performance, I was the first one of 6 children that was allowed to go to a high school prom. And I suddenly thought, Footloose, one of the more trivial things I've done in my life, really had an impact. It reached out and it changed a life. And you know, when you say it's regrettable that the people who should see this film won't see it, millions of people will see this film who never thought they would see anything like this. I'm convinced of that.
And I should probably add in this context that they're very fortunate to have as distributors Sony Pictures Classics. If it were a tinier company, I too might be apprehensive about the extent to which this film will open wider. But Sony Classics has an amazing track record that includes the films of Woody Allen. And I think they've been very good about their marketing campaigns, which may begin in urban locales like New York, but end up growing across the country.
It begins in screenings like this.
That's right. I mean,
Yeah.
it starts with us. You know, we tell our friends, you should see this, and the word ultimately does get out into pockets that may not even have been initially envisioned. So I'm going to be optimistic on this particular score, you know, for the time being anyway. We have time for like 1 or 2 more quick questions. There's one in the back.
I was interested in the very heavy political action of the firing by the minister. And it was, I thought, emblematic of the couple, that instead of politicizing and being angry, there was a real forgiveness, especially in that letter. A real underlining of the message to be that kids should be who they are.
Yeah.
I don't know if you all heard, but the refusal on the part of Ben and George to politicize the firing of George. Rather, it's the forgiveness that's implied in the letter, you know, seems to be emblematic of the film.
You know, I thank you for mentioning that. I think it's one of the things that's very distinct about this couple and is different than my generation. And it is a variation. I mean, I was involved in ACT UP, and I was an activist, and I was at Yale, I was very involved in political way. This couple was not that. And I think that there's two reasons. One is generation, and the other is also class. This is a film very much about economics. And I think that this is a couple who has real humility about their place in the economic world and their right to change things. They're not fighters, except in how they live. And I think that's something that is, you know, you really, once when we were working, I sent John and Fred, I saw a couple of two men in their 70s walking down the street in the West Village, and I followed them with a video camera, and I taped them because they were in a way, George and Ben, and not to say I know what their history was or if those two men fought, but I think there's something about the modesty of these two men, which is something that I cherish, and it's very much a part of who they are.
And yes, there's one more quick one.
Difference between being a homosexual of the 50s rather than being a gay activist?
A difference between being a homosexual of the 50s and being a gay activist?
Very much so. Very much so. And I think that this is a film, you know, I had a great uncle in Memphis, Tennessee, which is where I grew up, and he had a partner for 45 years who was an artist, and he died. His partner was named Ted Rust, and he died at 99, and he was the head of the art college there, and he was a sculptor. And he was with a man in Memphis for 45 years as a gay couple. They did not live in the same house, but they traveled together. And everyone knew them and invited them as a couple. But when I first made my first films, Ted thought they were too much. They were too open. He was uncomfortable. I mean, over time, he was very proud of the work that I was doing. And I have to say the thing, just in maybe sort of closing, is that this character is really closely modeled after Ted, who was working on his last sculpture at 98.
Wow.
And he'd always done classical busts and for churches and temples and things in my head. It was a journeyman sculptor, but at the end of his life, he did a piece about a teenage boy. He found a photograph of a teenage boy with a backpack, and it was the first contemporary piece he ever did, and he didn't finish it. And it's in clay, and an aunt of mine still has this piece in formation, and to me, the kind of character who at 98 was still, and by the way, he was also reading all of Shakespeare again because he hadn't read it since his 60s, and he thought it was time to start over. And that kind of passion creatively is something that you have. You really do. I mean, the fact that you're doing Albee and Shakespeare in a movie and
right, because
coming
in
into
the fall,
this is something
Edward Albee's A Delicate Balance is coming back to Broadway with Glenn Close and John Lithgow.
So this film is really is a testament to the beauty of that generation and what I've learned from it.
Yeah. I know we didn't get a chance to talk about many things, including Marissa Tomei, who gives yet another one of her rather brilliant performances.
Yeah.
And I must say, P.S., if anyone here loves these actors, almost 20 years ago, Mira Nair made a film called The Perez Family, which had Alfred Molina and Marissa Tomei as the couple. And I remember loving that film back in '95, so highly recommended. And we didn't have a chance to talk about future projects. You're in the new Tommy Lee Jones directed film Homesman, Interstellar, the new Christopher Nolan film with Matthew McConaughey and Jessica Chastain. There's a lot more to talk about, but it'll have to be for another time. For now, I'll just close with a line from the film. You've got what it takes. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. It really is such a pleasure.